split method of the string class is really useful for working with data that's in a string that is separated by a particular character. So it might be tab-delimited data or comma-delimited data. So here's an example where I have campus as a string variable equals South Mountain Community College. And each of those words are separated by a space. And I want to separate that phrase into separate words. So I have a words array of type string, and it equals campus.split, and the argument that I'm sending to the split method is a space. Now that's a character, not a string. That's why I have single quotes. So it's a single quote, space, single quote. And the result of that then would be, in memory, I would have my words array, and element 0 would be South, element 1 would be Mountain, element 2 would be Community, and element 3 would be College. That delimiting character, in this case the space, is not included in that data. Here's another example. I have a button, and I have a string in button code called numbers, and it equals 2, 6, 18, 12, 4, 17, 30, and 11, all comma delimited. And I'm going to take a temp array of type string and have it equal numbers.split. I'm going to split it on the comma. So again, it's a single quote, comma, single quote, a single character. Now that maintains a string. The split returns a string array. But I want to get it into integers. So then I have an integer array called myints, and it simply is going to be the length of however long temp is. And then I want to find the sum of all those numbers. So I need to convert them to integers to be able to find the sum. And maybe I want to do other things with these integers down the road. So I'm going to put them all into an integer array called myints. But to get them from the string array into the integer array, I need to convert them. And so I'm going to do that in a for loop. And I'm going to run that loop from 0 to 1 less than the length of my temp array. And each time through that loop, I'm going to say myints sub I equals, I'm going to take the temp sub I value and trim it. In case there's spaces after the commas, it's a good idea to always trim that data. And I'm going to parse that out into an integer value. And then while I'm doing that, I'm simply going to increment sum by whatever that value is. Now, if I take those numbers, 2, 6, 18, 12, 4, 17, 30, and 11, and sum those together, the answer should be 100. When that loop is done, I display in the message box the sum converted to a string and the title a total. And you can see over here, my result of this was 100. Most commonly, we probably use the split command in reading data from a text file that is maybe comma delimited or tab delimited. So here I have a sample text file of 3 lines, each containing an author's last name, first name, and a book. And I want to put that into an array. So I'm going to read that data one line at a time, and here we have my code snippet for doing this. I have an integer called I that I'm going to use as a counter to determine which row each book should go into. And we're going to say we've already set up this books array. So I'm going to read it into this books array. So I'm going to read from the data file one line at a time until I reach the end of the file. So while not sr.endofstream. And each time through that loop, we're going to do our sr.read line, but we're going to split it on the comma. And we're going to assign that to a temp array of type string. Then I can simply take those values and convert those into the different elements of my books array, using I as my row counter, and then 0 would be the last name, 1 would be the first name, and 2 would be the book. And again, I'm going to trim those in case there's any spaces between the comma and the next entity of that line. And then I'm going to increment I each time for that loop. And so that will populate my books array with the data, and books is a 2-dimensional array. It'll populate that with the data from the text file. Let's do this in our previous example from the last lesson with student data of first name, last name, and major. Let's read in that data from a text file rather than hard code in that data. And we'll use the split command to do that. In our previous lesson, we created a application that had hard-coded in it a number of students, first name and last name and their major, and we could cycle through those, and we placed that into a multidimensional array. We want to be able to read that data from a text file, and I've created a file called students2.txt, and this is in the order of last name, first name, major, where our array was first name, last name, major. And something to be aware of is sometimes your data is not in the same format as your data structure. So we'll compensate for that in our code. The other challenge is we're working with a multidimensional array. And some of those array methods, such as array.resize, do not work on multidimensional arrays. So I'm going to show you a way around that in reading this array, but it's going to require us to make some changes to our existing code. We're going to first fix our code to work with the hard-coded data, and then be able to read in the data to replace that. So let's go to our project. What we currently have is our data being populated with 10 rows of student data, but our text file might have more than 10 rows. It might have 20, it might have 40, it might only have 5. So I can't resize this array that's been hard-coded here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hard code of the students, and I'm going to cut that. I'm going to put it in the form load. So I'm going to add here a comment of load default students. And I'm going to paste this, and I'm going to change temp students. So we're creating a new array called temp students. Now up here in my class level variables, I had commented out previously of declaring students as a string data type without data, and I had 10 rows and 3 columns. I'm going to change this and create my array because I can't resize it. I'm going to size it here to be large enough to handle probably any instance of data I'd want to use. And we're going to assume we're not going to have a class of more than 100 students. I'm going to set another variable called last record, and I'll explain why I do that in a minute. And this can equal 99. And the reason I'm doing that is if I'm populating a array that takes 100 rows, but I'm only putting 10 in, I want to know what the last record is of the populated data, not of the size of my array. And that's where last record is going to be used. We're going to load this data into another array called temp students, two-dimensional string. It's going to give us 10 rows and 3 columns. But I want to take that data and put it into my students array. I want to clear whatever data is there. So I'm going to say array.clear. So there's a clear method of arrays, and I can pass it an array. Here I'm going to pass it students. I'm going to start with index 0, and I want to go through the length of students. -1. And in doing a length of a multidimensional array, it's really all the cells. That's what it's turning is the length of cells. And when we clear data in an array, it sort of flattens that array into a one-dimensional array of all the rows and all the columns together. And so we're going to write or clear each of the cells into a null value. So I have my temp students. I want to put that into students, and I'm going to do that with a loop. And we're going to do a couple nested loops. For int I equals 0, this is going to be our rows. Actually, let's use r for row. Int r equals 0. And r is less than temp students dot get length. I'm going to dimension 0. And then we'll increment r. Then I want a nested loop inside of that. Kind of the same thing. Here we'll do int c equals 0. And I know how many columns there are. There's going to be 3 columns, so c is less than 3. And we'll increment c. And then what we're going to do is we're going to transfer the data from temp students into students. My array of students, element R, element C, is going to be equal to temp students, element R, element C. I want to set last record equal to temp students dot get length dimension 0 minus 1. So one less than the length of the number of rows. And then I'm going to display my records. So we create our header, we update record display. Now in record display, let's take a look at that. I want to sort the students. We'll come back. Actually, let's fix the sorting of the students here. So I'm going to sort students, and in sorting students, I don't want to sort all those empty rows that might be there. So we're going to go in our nested loop, not from students.getLength0, but we're going to do less than last record. In here we'll say J equals is less than or equal to last record. That way we're only sorting the data from record 0 to wherever that last record is. Let's come back up to our update record. And if I were to run this, we'd end up getting an error because students I sub 0 might be a null statement at some point since we cleared that data up here in array.clear. I set those to null. And so when I can't pad a null value. I can pad a null string, but I can't pad a null value. So what we're going to do is put this inside an if loop. If students element I comma 0 is not equal to null, then we'll populate our text box. Okay, and one more thing I want to do is on those buttons for next and last. So what I'm going to do in the view next is I want to see if the current record is less than last record. Because if we leave it as the length, it's going to go down to record 100 or record 99, row 99. And the same thing here, I want to make this last record. Okay, that's going to allow us to continue using our hard-coded data. Let's see if this works still, and then we'll look at how to read in our data. So I'm still getting these values, and if I go to the last record, we should get Terry Veracruz. Go to the first record, we should get Reggie. The next doesn't go beyond the last, and then the previous doesn't go beyond the first. And I can modify records, and now our last record is Philip Vance, and our first record is Michaela Brown. Okay, so that's all working. Now we can read in data into our array and populate it the same way as we did our hard-coded data. And what I'm going to do is just copy this button and paste. And the text will be read external data. And let's code that. So let's kind of look at what we did here. We cleared our students and then we read data in. And so I'm going to kind of do it the same way. I want to clear my students. And normally I'd want to use a open file dialog. I'm not going to take the time to do that here, but if you're doing this for a client, you'd want to use that rather than hard coding the student data. Oh, we need to add a system.io so we have access to the system reader. So we're going to use using system.io. And then back down to our, I didn't name my button, it's named btn click. So I'm gonna change that. Let's copy this line of code again. Let's come in here. I'm gonna go to my events and I'm going to clear that click. Let's then rename it btn read, and then I can double click on it, and there is my btn read, and I'm going to clear my student data. Okay, so we're going to create a new stream reader object called SR, and SR then is going to equal file.openText, and the file I want to open, I'm going to hard code here. Again, preference would be to use an open file dialog, but our file was named students2.txt. So we know our array is 100 records. We may not have that many reading in our data, but I do want to keep track of how many records there are. So I'm going to create an integer. I'm just going to call idx equals 0. And then we use a while loop, and we'll do while sr.end of stream. Now, if we were doing this with an array that didn't exist, so you're reading in data into a multidimensional array, we'd probably want to read in that data, find how many rows there are, create our array, close that file, reopen it, and then read the data into the file. We've already have our array set up, so I don't need to do that here. I'm just going to read in the data, and I'm going to create a string array called temp, and it's going to equal sr.readline, and I want to split that on the comma. So we have this temporary string array that's going to contain the different elements of each line from that text file. Now I want to put that into my students array. So students element idx, comma. Now remember, we have our data in the format of last name, first name, and major, but our data structure of the array is first name, last name, major. So I want to put the last name into column 1, and that's going to equal temp element 0. And because there might be a space before or after that, I'm just going to use the trim method to get rid of any spaces. I'm going to do the same thing for the other elements. So I'm going to copy that line, I'm going to paste, and idx element 0 should be temp 1. That's the first name. In fact, I might put a little comment here of last name and first name. And then row or column 2 would be equal to temp 2. Each time through that loop, I want to increment idx. Now, when that's all said and done, I want to set last record equal to idx minus 1, the index of that last row. And now we can call our update record display method. All right, let's try this. So there's our original hard-coded data. Again, I can still modify those records, but now I want to read the external data. All right, we had a little error here. It didn't find my data file of students2.txt because I misspelled students. Let's fix that, and let's try rerunning. I'm going to read in my external data. There's my external data. And I'm noticing two things here. One is I'm not getting the correct first record here. If I go to the next record, though, I am getting the correct ones there. I'm getting the correct last, and I'm now getting the correct first. So it's just that initial record being displayed. And I notice I have record 1 of 100, but I don't have 100 records. I only have this many records. So let's modify both of those to fix that. So in our now showing, okay, so let's come up to where we're setting that value, and that was in our show record. I have students.getLength. I want to set this to last record. And I'm going to add 1 to it because that's the index number and not how many rows. Just so we're adding 1 to current record. All right, that should fix that issue. Let's figure out why it's not updating the first record. So we have update record display, calling this, and it updates the record display. It sorts the students, but nowhere in here is it showing the record. So I'm going to add show record here. Or I could have added it down here. Either way would have worked. Let's try this again. So there's my hard-coded students. I'm going to read the external. Notice I have Reggie Blackburn here, which is my first record. I'm going to read the external, and now I'm getting Hannah Abernathy. And I'm showing record 1 of 16. Are there 16 records? 5, 10, 13, 16. So yes, that is correct, and everything now is working nicely. We've read in that data. If I use that open file dialog rather than hard coding the file name, I could open different rosters for different courses and have that displayed here. So that's the challenge in loading data into a class level or global multidimensional array. We need to make sure the array is large enough to handle that, and then to be able to clear that array and put the data into the array. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.